Thank you, and welcome back to our final closing panel discussion, which will be looking at the applications of AI. So we have three panelists with us here, Dr. Korot, Professor Banerjee, and Ms. Harwich, who will be providing their insights into this. So they are all happy for delegates to take screenshots and record if they wish to. And at the end of the discussion, we will be taking questions from the delegates, either through the raise hand function on Zoom or the Zoom chat or the Slido website. So let me begin by introducing our speakers. Dr. Edward Korot is guided by the goal of maximally scaling improvements in patients' lives through technology. He recently completed a clinical research fellowship at UCL/Morrisfield with a grant for applied automated machine learning. At the same time, he worked with Google Health with a focus on the global validation of ophthalmic deep learning algorithms for clinical use. His work there also involves projects in medical AI safety, quantifying model uncertainty, AI-driven pharmaceutical trial recruitment, partner management, and UX research. Beyond this, he's also initiated a spin-out company to create a purpose-built head-mounted surgical display. And his current stop is Stanford for Vitreoretinal Surgery Fellowship. Next, we have Professor Emin Banerjee, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Biomedical Informatics at the Department of Radiology Core, where their research areas are biomedical data mining and predictive modeling. She has a solid background in many areas of artificial intelligence, and natural language processing. During her postdoctoral training at Stanford University, she successfully carried out several innovative machine learning-based research projects related to development of predictive analysis techniques. And she was also a joint instructor with joint affiliation in radiology and biomedical data science department at Stanford University. Finally, we have Ms. Eleonora Harwich, who is a director of research at Reform Think Tank. Her work focuses on how tech innovations can help public services deliver better outcomes. She has co-authored papers on AI in the NHS, the value of healthcare data, commercial models in healthcare, the regulations of data-driven technologies, and data sharing in the public sector. She is a member of the British Standards Institution Committee on Artificial Intelligence, a member of the NIHR Artificial Intelligence Health and Care Award Panel, and a member of the AI Program Advisory Board for the Academic Health Science Network. So I'd like to begin the panel by asking our panelists where the healthcare industry is now with regards to applying artificial intelligence in a practical setting. So maybe Dr. Korot, you can start us off by telling us a bit about how your work with bringing AI into ophthalmological practice has been and how its application has changed from when you started to now in the present day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I would say that the actual application of AI to clinical practice is in its infancy. There's been a lot of research. There's always a lot of research articles coming out, but we're just starting to see it actually applied. I'll give you an example. We have in ophthalmology one FDA-approved AI algorithm, and that's for diabetic retinopathy detection. So that's diabetic eye disease, which is the #1 cause of vision decrease in developed countries. And so there's one algorithm that's approved by the FDA. I think actually another one got approved this week, so make that 2. And we actually at Stanford are starting to integrate that into our screening service now. So we're just starting to actually apply it. And before that, we would get images sent in that we'd have to manually grade for primary care offices. But now I think we're gonna launch within the next few weeks where we're gonna actually go live with this algorithm. So it was approved in 2016. And there's always that gap between approval and application, and before that you have the FDA pivotal trials. So it takes a while, but we're just starting to apply it in order to basically save clinician time, because there's so much time demands on clinicians. And I think one of the first places that we'll actually see it applied is spots that not necessarily are at the forefront of the most complex algorithm, or an algorithm that can diagnose and manage disease, but just with algorithms that can, for example, trend diseases over time, summarize a lot of data and present it to the clinician. That's where our first application is going to be, because that's where the biggest need is. So there's predictive algorithms to see how diseases are going to fare, to try to pick personalized treatments. That's in the future. It's being published now, but just more simple algorithms uh, like like things that will quantify medical imaging in 3D over time and be able to segment those images, give a clinician an idea of how of how a tissue is changing over time, where it's really hard to integrate a 3D map of retina, for example, over 10 visits in your brain. That's something that computers can do really well. So those types of simple things, I think, will be applied first.
Right, thank you. And Ms. Harwich or Professor Banerjee, do you have anything that you'd like to add on to that?
Sure. So I think I'd kind of completely second that it's the applications of artificial intelligence, at least from kind of my knowledge base, which is mostly kind of the UK, is still in its infancy. It's a lot of trials going on at any single kind of point in time, really. And I'd say even for the ones where you have had a kind of CE mark certification on those products, then you have kind of other issues that might kind of hamper the application on the ground in the NHS, which might be, kind of lack of common data infrastructure, which means that you actually have a teensy bit more interventions to do to be able to actually apply those tools in a clinical setting, which might, delay your capacity to actually be able to scale and really have a kind of off-the-shelf product that you might just be able to diffuse more easily. And I think there's also potentially a kind of difference depending on the intended use of the product. So say, for example, if you're seeking to do a product that is direct to consumer, you might have kind of a whole host of different things that you might kind of think about than if it's a kind of product that is aimed to clinicians. And I actually think that there might be a teensy bit more limitations in terms of the applications for the kind of more complex clinical decision support tools than the kind of direct to consumer, kind of symptom checkers and so on that you see proliferate a lot on the kind of app stores or Google stores, where you do see a teensy bit more diffusion of AI in those type of applications.
So I actually have a little bit different opinion, because my main work is mainly focused on oncology and radiology, but we see a lot of FDA approved clinical tools, not only with the hype of deep learning, but even before deep learning, when there was just radiomics, we still see a lot of FDA approved tools applied in radiology. So even if you look at now, just like what tools actually integrated deep learning within radiology, we still see like 15 to 20 tools that is FDA approved. But the problem that we are facing currently is that there is also a huge hype in developing open source tools for radiology, like, like all this hype with image analysis, and they are like releasing the data, releasing the model, but we see very, very few times the overlap between the open source model and the model which are commercialized. And the model that are mainly commercialized, the problem is that they are mainly like kind of black box. So we don't really know like what is going on inside. We don't know what model they are using, what data they are testing on. But in contrast, actually, when you look at the open source tools, we know what model they use, what data they use, what are their performance. But when you look at the FDA checklist, actually, you would see that FDA gives a lot of validation, a lot of emphasis mainly on the validation, but not on the model development. So they don't really care about what technology you use for the model development part. But in open source is like opposite. So I think that the field is going towards that direction, that we need both. We need like novel technology, we need advancement in technology, as well as we need a thorough validation that is missing in the open source tool or in the literature, you know. So somehow we need to create a kind of like combination of both if we want to like really push AI for doing much more complex tasks in radiology or in oncology or any medical domain. So I think that now the field is going towards that direction. Even if we look at the peer reviews, we would see that now the peer reviews are changed a lot. They are putting like more and more emphasis on the checklist. You should do this. But if you look at like at least 5 years before, you would see that they perform deep learning in medical imaging with just like 20 images, you know, which doesn't really have any kind of like sense. I feel like, it's my personal opinion again, but this field is changing. So I think that soon we'll see much more advancement in applying real application of AI in medical field.
Oh, just to add on to that, we have a question from one of our delegates, Lorna. She asked, is there any way we can interrogate the black box nature of AI decision making, since it's related to that theme?
Sure. So I would suggest, like, this is a very interesting question. So, but again, it depends on what kind of architecture you are using. Currently, there are a lot of different visualization methods that can allow you to look back of what the model is learning. The most simplest one in the silencing map. You can start with the silencing map, then go for layer-wise relevant propagation. So these are different methodology that you can use to put more interpretability in the model. But still, the problem is that these are interpretability which is very much focused on very granular data. I don't know how much it is actually helpful for human interpretation. It is for the machine interpretation. So this is another lacking in our field, that we have to join somehow human interpretation versus machine interpretation. So how we can convert that what we are getting from the machine interpretation to a kind of like semantic interpretation that can be easily read or understood by the humans or the doctors.
Just to add to that, there are some interesting studies right now where they're trying to integrate different saliency maps and region-based attribution maps into actual reader studies, where they'll show them to a clinician and see if their performance improves with the saliency maps as compared to just a physician making a diagnosis with the AI, and then without the AI, and then with the AI with a saliency map. So I think those types of reader studies are going to be very useful in the field to see actually how clinicians will actually use these algorithms, and if their diagnostic performance will increase with a clinical decision support context. So.
Thank you for that. And so moving on to the next question. So since AI brings a lot of potential, has a lot of potential in healthcare, I'd like to ask our speakers what they believe the greatest benefits of integrating AI into healthcare are. And were there any moments in their experience with AI that really highlight this? Anyone want to start?
Yes, I'll just go real quick. So the benefit, I think, is twofold. One, I think I harped on this a little bit before. It's going to save time, hopefully, by integrating a lot of data into hopefully a coherent display for the clinician. So time savings will allow the clinician to actually be more present with the patient. A lot of technology actually doesn't save time, like electronic healthcare records, but I think AI can actually do that.
So I would just continue with that story. Actually, it is very nice of my experience in Stanford. So we developed a tool actually that can predict 3-month survival of metastatic cancer patient by reading all the clinical notes that they have. So this project actually was proposed to us by clinician, by the Stanford oncology department, and it was very cool. So we developed the project. We got like very good accuracy. But then we wanted to go for clinical trial because we published it. We did everything clinical trial. So Stanford has this rule that before even clinical trial, you can do a kind of like quality and safety kind of project without going for like full step. You can just check how your model performing without really doing the patient care. So we actually installed those models in the oncologist's office, and we came back after 1 month. We were really excited to see that how they really applied that system in their practice. But it seemed that they didn't really use the prediction. What they usually do it like, we also develop a visualization which shows like what the model is actually looking at for every clinical notes by extracting the important text snippet. So they actually use that more than the prediction, because for them it is interesting because they don't have to go back to like 1 year data to read the data and understand that how the patient history was, what kind of disease the patient had before, what kind of medication that patient has before. This system actually kind of giving a kind of like summarization of the information. So that was like more interesting for them, just to show that it saves time because they don't have to read the notes. It reduces the redundancy. So it presents you a kind of like summarized visualization. But I think that after that experience, I feel that the AI application is mainly to reduce redundancy and save times for clinician. So that's exactly as he mentioned, that so that the clinician can be present with patient more time than saving time by going through electronic healthcare records.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with what was said by previous speakers. And I think the one thing that I'd add to that is potentially what, at least in the UK, is often seen as a kind of lower hanging fruit of just thinking about the kind of different applications that you can have for kind of simple process optimization as well. That, for example, you know, kind of better scheduling of operating theaters, kind of resource optimization that can, you know, be a huge time saver and can actually make a massive difference in terms of how resources are used within a hospital. And that is something that I know, at least in the UK, is definitely something that has, you know, is potentially not what is getting the headlines, because obviously it's not as sexy as saying, you know, we'll cure cancer or we'll, you know, prevent blindness or whatever it is, but it is often something that can make a massive difference on the ground.
Right, thank you so much. That was very interesting to hear all the different benefits. But despite all this progress, the integration of AI into regular day-to-day health provisions can still be considered quite limited. Maybe Ms. Harwich, what do you think are the greatest regulatory implications and algorithm limitations going forward?
Wow, it's a big question. I think it kind of it depends again on kind of what regulatory framework you're kind of talking about. But I guess one of the difficulties with, for example, the kind of CE marking approach that you have in Europe and still in the UK, so the kind of Brexit date has not yet been kind of passed. I think one of the kind of difficulties is that right now there is no kind of standardized way to validate an algorithm. And so that is still something that is, I guess, the kind of big question mark in terms of trying to understand how you might go through that regulatory process for CE marked devices. There are loads of interesting studies that are being done currently. So there's right now a partnership between this institution called NHS Digital and the Medicines and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency in the UK, trying to understand if potentially using synthetic data to be able to validate algorithms in the CE marking process might be a way where you can actually kind of create an international standard to be able to validate algorithms, which I think is quite interesting. But what I'd see as the kind of main regulatory gap really is for me in the kind of direct-to-consumer apps. So if you actually have a look at a lot of the direct-to-consumer apps in, be it the Google Store or the Apple Store, a lot of the kind of applications that should be classified as medical devices are not. And so, for example, you find this in, say, for example, period trackers or kind of fertility trackers that you have, that some of them, the kind of claims that they make are just completely insane, of saying, for example, this app will increase fertility, which obviously logically makes literally no sense. And so a lot of the claims that are being made for things that should be classified as medical devices, you know, are kind of not being verified or validated, mostly because for the kind of lower risk applications. So obviously when you kind of classify medical devices, you have different categories of risk. So you have class 1, which is relatively lower risk, and it goes all the way to class 3, which is kind of way more risky type of devices. The class 1 devices, the way that it kind of works is that entrepreneur or company would basically kind of approach the MHRA and say, hey, I have a class 1 device, would kind of fill out the form that they need to fill out, and it's kind of marking your own homework situation. And then at class 2, you actually get involved with these other agencies that are called notified bodies that then actually go and verify the evidence and information that you've kind of provided. And I think right now, a lot of the kind of class 1 devices are not being regulated as kind of stringently as they possibly could, just because regulators, at least in the UK, don't have the capacity to be able to do any kind of audits of those devices. So ultimately, it's kind of very difficult to know what is out there. I guess in good news, the new medical devices regulation from the European Union will still be applied in the UK, although the date has been slightly delayed, will well, firstly do 2 things. One, a lot of the apps that are classified right now as class 1 will be upclassed as class 2. So we'll kind of follow greater regulatory scrutiny. And then the other thing is that also distributors of those apps, so the App Store and Google Store, will also be responsible for checking the kind of accuracy of the information that is kind of distributed by them. And at least that, I think, is a kind of good thing. But there are several, regulatory pitfalls and difficulties. But those, I think, are the kind of 2 that worry me a bit more.
What about you, Professor Banerjee? What are your thoughts? And how have patients responded to the use of AI to make diagnoses? Has this been?
Sure. I don't know how much you are aware of that. So here actually in US, we have a PCORI, which is actually a foundation on National Health Institute, which is led by the patients. So this is very interesting. So we can directly communicate with them and understand what they are thinking about this tool. And you'll be amazed, they have a lot of support for the AI grants, and patients are really, really interested in the AI applications of healthcare. And so, for example, in US, actually, when you apply for IRB, whenever you are building any AI model, actually, you need data, right? Even if it is in the same institution, you need to apply for the IRB. So this is a very long process. You describe what kind of data you need and blah, blah, blah. And so that even the data is anonymized sometimes so that you don't know where the data is coming from. But when we talk with the patients, actually, we describe the process, but the patients was like, yeah, I know that my data is used in AI application, but nobody reached me back saying that how my data was helpful or what you found from my data. So which was particularly interesting for us as AI researcher, because we thought that the patient never wanted to know what we are doing with their data or never wanted to share their data. But actually it is opposite. Most of the patients really are interested in distributing their data, knowing what we are doing with their data, if the data was really helpful. For example, we found one patient actually who has a very interesting history, because in his family, actually, they have a lot of cancer patients. And they were really interested in knowing that why in my family has a lot of cancer patients. And we found that what is the reason, because we did the genetic study, we understand their whole family history, we understand their EHR. So which was pretty interesting for us, that we found something and that patient is interesting on that, but we cannot communicate with the patient because we declare in the IRB that we will never communicate with the patient. But so even if I know that is that particular patient, I cannot tell him that, okay, your family data was very interesting. So that is particularly interesting for us. I think that we need to resolve it somehow. And I completely agree with the patient point of view that they really want to know that what we are doing with their data. And their data is not really misused, but their data has a lot of value, and we are currently using that value, So that's kind of strange thing for me, that the data is actually owned by the institution, not by the person. But I think that the field is going towards that direction, that the patient will carry their own digital profile. It's not only the EHR data, the patient will have their Twitter data, their social media data, their family history, everything in a digital format, so that they would own the data, and finally they would have actually the capability to distribute the data with the AI researcher, and that could give the high value to the AI model building, or will change this kind of infrastructure.
Right. So, Dr. Korot, do you have anything else to add, or can I take questions from the delegates?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think patient engagement is key. So at Google, one of our main outreach was get the patients in there on focus groups. So when you can afford to do that, when you have enough support, you can do focus groups, you can show them where the data is being used, and they are definitely very engaged usually and excited. One thing I would like to add is patients are really interested in home care. So home monitoring of chronic diseases. You know, everyone has a smartphone. I think the latest numbers I saw from 2019 was that even patients over 65, over 70% have smartphones, and they're very interested in being able to monitor things at home, especially nowadays in the times of COVID where they don't want to go to the hospital. So I think that's going to be one of the big areas of focus. Patients being able to monitor their chronic diseases at home, being engaged that way more often through their phone with alerts, things like that in their own care. So.
Thank you so much. I think since we're running short on time, we'll just take one question, but we do have quite a few questions from the Slido website, so perhaps we can forward those to you. And if you have time to reply to those, we'll circulate them back to the delegates. I see that Jiaqi is wanting to ask a question, so Jiaqi, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yep. Hello, this is Jiaqi. Thank you so much, panelists. So actually, I'm a medical student, so I wanted to ask a question regarding some of the points mentioned earlier about applications of AI for the healthcare professional side, especially for use in diagnostics. So I understand, like Dr. Korot, you work on using AI to recognize diabetic retinopathy using like fundoscopy images and things like that. But probably, like as you said, the applications of AI is still in its infancy and not very, I suppose, not a lot of pictures or conditions can be diagnosed in this way. So I was just wondering, how accurate are these AI technologies in terms of diagnostics? And given that they're still in clinical trials and in its infancy, how long do you estimate we can start seeing these technologies in clinical practice? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think there's two problems. One is that to see if a algorithm is accurate enough and compared to a clinician, you actually need to know how accurate clinicians are. And there's not a lot of work out there to quantify clinician diagnostic accuracy. So I think from studying algorithm accuracy, I think actually right now there's being more focus on quantifying clinician accuracy to actually be able to compare them. So I think that's really important. And then I also think that another important area of focus, beyond if you have a simple one disease classifier, or like at Google, we had a 50 disease classifier, for example, regardless of how many labels you give and train on and then are able to classify and give a prediction for, you need the algorithm to know when it doesn't know. So we call that out of distribution detection. So every disease has its own distribution, be it a Gaussian or normal distribution or not. There's always going to be a tail end of different cases or different imaging models or artifacts or a smudge on the lens or things like that that will be seen in real life. And humans are really good at this. So if you show somebody, someone who's not as experienced, be it a chest x-ray or something they don't know, they're like, I don't know what this is, but this isn't normal. So I'm going to go get an expert and show them. AI models are not very good at knowing when they don't know. They will a lot of times give confidently wrong predictions. So I think a major important focus for AI safety is enabling models to know when they don't know. So that's called out of distribution detection. So.
Great, thank you so much to all of our panelists. I think if we'll have to move on now to our closing keynote speaker, but thank you once again for your really insightful contributions to this discussion. So to conclude CamWHO 2020, we are really excited to welcome Dr. Reza Khorshidi. Dr. Khorshidi is currently the Chief Scientist at AIG and an investigator in machine learning and deep machine program of the University of Oxford. His current research at Oxford is focused on problematic machine learning and deep sequence models for biomedical informatics, population health, and precision medicine. More specifically, he is interested in using machine learning for the development of personalized health predictions and recommendations, and an improved understanding of multimorbidity. At AIG, Dr. Khorshidi's team is a group of, Investments AI is a group of scientists, engineers, designers, and product managers / strategists primarily focused on the development of AI-first products in the fintech space. So today, he will be talking to us about AI-first medicine, alternative data in medicine, and AI for electronic health records. Before we start, I'd like to let our delegates know that we will not be recording this session.